This is CityCast Seattle. I'm Jane C. Hu, and here's what Seattle's talking about.
Orcas are doing donuts at the Ballard Locks like they pay rent there, and a meteor shower is lighting up the sky for free without a beverage grifter trying to sell you a $14 beer. But first, can Seattle stop youth gun violence? Would new gun laws actually make a difference? I'm Marcus Harrison Green, owner and operator of this velvety tenor, founder of the South Seattle Emerald and Hinton Publishing, and co-host of the podcast In the Meanwhile, and I'm filling in for Jane this week. Since the Bite of Seattle shooting, much of the conversation in our city has revolved around gang violence, youth violence, and legal approaches to youth possession of firearms. So we wanted to talk with someone who was working with youth to interrupt and prevent violence daily. Joining me is William Hairston, Director of Impact Programs for the Center for Children and Youth Justice. Welcome, William, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Marcus, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Just wanted to get right into it. You know, we sometimes talk about quote unquote gang violence as though the word gang explains everything. But I want to ask you, what does that framing illuminate, and what can it also obscure about why young people become involved in violence?
I think that's a great question. I think when you hear the word gang, depending on, who you are, what age you are, right, and generation, it looks and sounds differently. I think kind of as we've modeled it in our Youth Link program, is it's group or gang. And that means is it a organized group of young people that call themselves something that are acting out or having antisocial behaviors, so to speak, or is it just a handful of friends that maybe are running around and doing things that cause harm? So how do you kind of connect those things? So that gang from the 90s is not the same as gang from today, if that makes sense.
You know, when I'm out and about, there are a lot of Seattleites I'll talk to, and they're kind of be like, how do we know that this works, right? I mean, it's sort of this invisible work. Folks will see headlines when, a youth, gets into trouble, or, there's some tragedy that happens, but we never see headlines of like, oh, this youth just lived a typical Tuesday as if it was a typical Tuesday. And so I want to ask you, how do we actually, know that these preventative measures work? And what should the public actually look at to determine whether youth violence prevention organizations are succeeding?
What I would say is I'd say functionally, right, like it's hard to measure things that don't happen, but it's also not hard to measure things that do happen, right? If we're going to say that a program is successful or unsuccessful because there's an incident in a space, what are all of the successes that program or that organization was having in that space? And how do we highlight those things? And one of the ways I would say it's easiest is to look at, violence over time, right? Like if we're going to say there were, 10 shootings in the CD or on the South End between X date and X day, well, when this program got money and started working in that area, now there's 8 or there's 7, and we can measure that. I think that the issue is that a lot of our programs are doing work and we're not necessarily all connected in a way in which we can measure those impacts or show those outcomes other than, like you said, like what does a normal Tuesday look like for a young person? It's hard to show or articulate that on paper. So,
yeah, I've also noticed this tendency that when we talk about youth gun violence, it's usually most intensely after a horrific shooting, right? Like what happened at the Bite. And so I want to ask, from where you sit right now, what are we missing when we begin the conversation at the moment a young person pulls a trigger rather than, looking at their life months or years earlier?
Yeah, well, I think kind of the answer to that is I think really when you say that, if you circle back to when the talk becomes intense, it's after an event, but it's not after every event that is a shooting or anything. It's after specific events. And then it becomes, in my mind, and not speaking for anybody else other than myself, but I think that's a blame situation, right? Like, how do we blame or deflect, right? And then how do we then raise awareness to what I want, if that makes sense. So there was a horrific shooting at the Bite of Seattle. Like you mentioned, it crossed over into a zip code that maybe folks don't experience that. And then so it's like, well, it has to be someone's fault. So now it's youth violence's fault. Well, who wasn't doing youth violence? Oh, well, we paid all this money. Let's hire more police. But really holistically, like you said, looking back, just the police are a reactionary thing, right? They react to crime, they react to violence. So just having 800 more police officers doesn't prevent violence holistically in the moment, right? Like when things are happening, when young people or old people are emotionally charged and doing stuff. So I think being able to find ways to coordinate and convene which is what we do here at CCYJ in a couple different capacities. I think that's really the thing, is it gets elevated in those situations when someone has to be at fault, right? Because people are scared. Because when it's in a neighborhood like maybe you and I grew up in, and it's another Tuesday, right? Like nobody says anything and we all just kind of keep moving about our lives, right? Like, so.
You know, I remember living through the quote unquote super predator era, right, in the 90s, where you had politicians and elected officials and high ranking, public officials. The first lady at the time, Hillary Rodham Clinton, talk about these super predators and, essentially crafting this narrative about young Black adults who are wild. And right, what I'm worried about now is that when we talk about, youth crime, and how sort of these narratives help produce extraordinarily punitive policies, particularly toward Black and brown kids. I'm just wondering, do you hear echoes of that era and how we're talking about young people and guns today?
When you circle back to, right, like that super predator kind of era and structure, really, if you reframe it, right, like the violence and the things that were happening that they were seeing and elevating, right, like those were like super survivors, but right, those are folks that were doing what they needed to do under their thought process in their lifestyle or their environment. I think that we always are going to hear echoes when it comes to young Black and brown people about accountability, no matter how hard they hold us to account, right? Like when we look at sentencing structures, when we look at all these things, we're always sentenced harder. We're always in jail for longer. We always get more of that. But as we can see, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because there's root causes that are affecting these choices that young people are making. So even though the volume on that comment had died down, but if you still go back and look at it, it's like same young people, Caucasian young person, Black young person, same crimes, right? Caucasian young person, 6 months in probation, Black young person, 12 years in jail, right? Like, so I think when we look at that, we've always still been kind of held to account, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I do want to ask you, William, like there's so often that we hear the phrase invest in prevention, but can you make that concrete for us? If our city was going to allocate $10 million tomorrow, specifically to reduce youth gun violence, where would you put that? And then conversely, what are we spending our money on right now that gets labeled as public safety, but probably isn't doing much to actually prevent a shooting from happening?
There's different types of prevention, right? Like, are we preventing homelessness? Like, what are we preventing? If we're going to say, hey, we want to prevent violence, like, then we need to be very targeted in our investments in the areas in which we invest and why, right? Like, and that doesn't necessarily mean we just got to have more police or more outreach workers. Maybe we need more youth employment options. Maybe we need more housing options. Maybe we need more of these things. And I think that prevents some of the trauma or survivor mode that our young people are in that cause those things, or even also can create better senses of belonging when you have consistent meal and a consistent place to stay and those type of things that then reduce the involvement or the belonging in that group or gang, where now we're having group think or we're acting out on other young people when we're emotionally charged. So I think kind of that would be kind of like my first thing as well from preventing. And then if we're going to say, hey, we want to specifically prevent community violence in certain age range, I think that's to do that, it's not as much as relationships are the key factor in that, and having people that can engage with those young people and change behavior. You can't have a person that's supposed to engage with a young person and change their behavior. That's also the young person's landlord, their administrator for school, right, like that has all of these other things where they're trying to plug the young person in. So that's really where I think our niche
those
is.
dynamics.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where our niche is really at CCYJ, is coordinating and convening in the community violence intervention and prevention space. Is how do we bring, right, the school district, the probation officer, the court, the outreach worker, and everybody to the table, so that the outreach worker can be focused on the behavior change and supporting that young person and connecting them to the other people that are supposed to support those needs, because we're already paying for that work, right? Like, so how do we make sure we're getting the most bang for our buck by connecting? That's what I'd say is is that's how I would suggest the prevention goes, in a collaborative manner. So we're holistically operating and supporting the young person and their family for those needs. What are some things that we're paying for maybe that aren't helping? That's a great question. I wouldn't know because I don't know all of the things that we're paying for, but what I will say is we're probably paying for a lot of things that would help and would be of great supports, but they're siloed in either their own system or their own organization. So even things that are probably really good that we're paying for, we're probably still not maximizing those dollars.
Right. Obviously, you work across sort of a broad range of systems and organizations, from child welfare to juvenile justice to housing, education, and employment. So I do want to ask, what are some stats and measurements that you would want to have elevated to the layperson, if you will, to maybe grab onto in terms of showing that, these systems of prevention are actually successful?
There's a bunch of them. I mean, I think you can just look at directly like crime stats, some like across the nation, places that have invested in CBI. Their crime is down all over the country. Like when you look at Baltimore and some of these other places,
Right.
Folks that have invested in training and making sure that our folks that are boots on the ground have good tools, not programs, not like, oh, we do this program this way, but what are the tools that allow them to be successful? CCYJ specifically with our LINK program, the way we coordinate and convene folks, we've been able to serve 400 young people that are either group or gang involved, carrying a weapon, right, or have immediate access to people that have caused harm or have been caused harm since 2020. We've accomplished over 300 goals for those young people since 2025. Those include everything from like completing court-ordered probation, improving school attendance and school outcomes, right, securing housing or basic needs, and most importantly, like the reduction of like group or gang involvement, right? And maybe that same friend group is still together, but they're all connected now to more pro-social activities, so they're not moving in the same way. So when we do things in a coordinated manner, we have great successes here, and we know across the country, even when they're just funding it and not coordinating it, they've had good successes. But when they're really coordinating it and folks are working collaboratively together with both community and systems, the outcomes are undeniable. There's a path and a lane both for law enforcement and accountability, and there's a path and a lane for community, right, and restoration, and making sure that people are kind of seeing both those lanes and not just seeing one, because one alone doesn't solve the problem. Even though there are a lot of good people doing good work, it doesn't always sound like that because everyone's real siloed. So if you know people that are doing good work, or you see it, right, like make sure you're elevating it or talking it up. Or if you don't know, make sure you're asking questions because they have answers because they're doing work.
Yeah. William, thank you for doing the work that you do. And we will leave it there for this moment. Well, now, dear listeners, let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll attempt something increasingly controversial in modern life. Looking at actual facts about gun violence and seeing if they bear any resemblance whatsoever to the story we've been so confidently repeating to ourselves. We'll be right back. Last year saw a 61% decrease in the number of juvenile shooting victims from 2024 and marked the lowest numbers seen since before the pandemic. The declines coincide with a drop nationally in crimes allegedly committed by young people. Crime has fallen steadily since the 1990s. The pandemic may have disrupted that trend, but arrests nationwide are now below pre-COVID levels. Joining me to discuss, Brett Hamil, writer, performer, and the cartoonist behind the weekly series Doom Loop. Brett, such a pleasure to see you.
Hello, my illustrious and courageous publisher.
And along with Brett, we have the wonderful, multi-hyphenated creative producer of CityCast, Sam J. Leeds. Sam, thank you for being here with us today.
I didn't have a choice. No, I'm kidding. I'm
wouldn't
happy
be
to be here.
Well, obviously a bit of levity here in a very serious situation and conversation. And so let's start here. It kind of feels, I would say, like a contradiction in the sense that Seattle has experienced several horrifying, highly visible shootings. But at the same time, juvenile shooting victims fell 61% last year to their lowest level since before the pandemic, as I mentioned. So I want to ask, I mean, can both things be true, right? That we have a serious youth gun violence problem and that the broader trajectory is still actually improving?
If you live on the south end, you wouldn't know, but everywhere else in the city mostly seems unaffected by this, other than maybe up on North Aurora.
Right.
So it is a problem that very much involves the focus of local media and in its promulgation, right? So, I mean, I would have to refer back, and if you haven't read Marcus's piece, he says, you know, he wrote this piece for the Emerald. Gun violence didn't move to Seattle Center. Our attention did. And I mean, I was just reading it thinking like, this is the final word, at least from the sort of progressive South End perspective.
We know that this country has a gun violence problem. So any reduction in gun violence is happening against that backdrop. It can be true that gun violence is falling and that there is still a broader problem that we have to face both as a city and as a country. And I think it's challenging to face it as a city when our country is not exactly setting a standard that we can follow. We have to sort of be the leaders in that as a city. And I think that's really difficult to do because we are not an island.
No, we are not. That said, though, I do, and you brought this up earlier, Britt, like how much responsibility is there on local media, right? I mean, because it seems like, you know, obviously individual shootings gets a lot of oxygen, but at the same time, again, you know, want to just reiterate, there was a 61% decline in juvenile shooting victims, you know, year over year. And that seems that's a footnote. And, you know, I was talking to a friend of mine who works over in Chicago, and he was like, you know, my God, you would think from some of the national news media and even checking in on some of the local media, you would think that it was C-RAC, as, you know, they call it Chirac over in Chicago, you know, because of the, you know, high levels of you know, gun violence. I'm not at all trying to trivialize any shooting is a tragedy. You know, that said, I think we can both hold grief and perspective at the same time. And so how do we avoid creating a distorted picture simply through what gets covered?
I mean, the local legacy media is everything in terms of the crime narrative. It is a system, you know, mostly owned by rightward leaning, if not outwardly MAGA CEOs. For the broadly speaking, that's true. And
you're talking about like Sinclair with Como.
I'm talking about Sinclair Media, you know, Como, Cairo, King 5, Fox. It definitely dictates the discourse, and it's a very asymmetrical media environment. So if you're not, if you're looking at other things, you're going to meet a lot of people who are talking about what they keep seeing on King and Cairo, et cetera. The interesting thing is when you live on the South End, you have to do a sort of dual bookkeeping for whether there's crime in the city, because we see it. I live right near Rainier. I mean, there have been at least 3 to 5 actual shooting deaths within a mile radius of where I live in the past 3 to 4 years. So I have to be able to say, you know, yeah, things are pretty crappy down here. But why are people in Broadmoor trumpeting how bad crime is? I know it's not like that up there. When I go up to like Finney or somewhere and I walk around in the neighborhoods, they're just these idyllic settings. You know, when I walk around here around Rainier, you know, you have to walk around stuff and, you know, keep your head on a swivel. So you just have this sort of dual bookkeeping, which is like, it's always been this way.
Right.
There's been massive disinvestment from the South End, but everywhere else, why are they the ones shouting about this? It's a weird position to be in.
Yeah, Sam, to Britt's point, is there a danger maybe of going too far in any other direction, right? Of, you know, somebody saying crime is down to someone who's, you know, as Britt was saying, like, you know, he's had 3 shooting deaths in 3 years, or in a place like Aurora, right? Where, you know, saying that can be like, okay, your crime is down, but I'm still impacted by, you know, what's going on around me. So how do we talk honestly, you think, about, you know, these improving crime statistics without minimizing the, you know, real violence and grief that some people are experiencing?
I think there's a couple ways to answer that question. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is that it doesn't feel like we often take the time as a city, as a neighborhood, as a community to actually feel the grief of this violence when it happens. You know, so quickly with the shooting earlier this year of the 2 high school students on Rainier, and also with the Bite of Seattle shooting, we moved from this horrible thing happened to who's to blame for it, and spent very little time in the space of how do we actually sit with the impact of this? How do we sit with the grief of this, not just for the individual families, but as people who live in the city and are grieving the loss of community members, or grieving the loss of children's lives being cut short, of parents being taken from their kids. And I think the role that media could play, and sometimes does play, is uplifting who these people were, the impact that they had in their communities, the people that will miss them, and having a broader conversation about what we lose when, somebody is killed. And then in addition to that, I think that there is also a lot of care that needs to be taken with holding up one specific example and saying this is everyone's experience.
Right.
And it's clearly not. I mean, like, you're both talking about shootings that are happening in the South End. I live in Queen Anne. I'm not experiencing that in the same way. But, with the Bite of Seattle shooting, I heard the sirens from my apartment when, paramedics started responding to that shooting, and knew something was going on, because that's uncommon for me to hear that level of sirens. I'm sort of speaking long here, but I think that there's like a real need to hold multiple things at once that is often really challenging to do in a 24-hour news cycle where, we're just like one thing to the next thing to the next thing. It actually requires us to sit with things quite a bit longer.
And I would also just add that what the legacy media discourse becomes also depends on things like where we are in the election cycle. The way I saw the discourse, it immediately went from there's this horrible shooting to the mayor should resign, which was like, we're going to talk about some other stories later. There's orcas in the Ballard Locks. Well, the mayor should resign. Something, it just
my
literally. My
cornflakes were soggy this morning.
They had, every time something like this happens, I feel a deep sadness, not just for the lives affected, but for the way this will immediately, within minutes, be leveraged to push a certain political perspective.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. This will definitely be a conversation that I'm sure we'll revisit over and over again, unfortunately. That said, it has been quite a heavy conversation. So why don't we take a break? And when we come back, let's have a little bit more joy and a little bit more levity in our midweek medley. Well, folks, we've made it to the middle of the week. I know this is 3 days that have seemed like 85 years, but no, it is Wednesday, so we are almost to the weekend. So to start, around 5 p.m. on Monday evening, visitors at the Ballard Locks spotted not salmon, not even seals, but orcas. So Sam, I know that you did some digging and found these kinds of sightings might become more common. So can you tell us more about this?
Gladly. The University of Washington, between crows and orcas, I feel like they've really got the market cornered. They did a study that found that the endangered southern resident killer whales, which are the ones that we normally see kind of in our waters around the Puget Sound, are spending less time in inland waters, but their larger cousins, who are the ones that were spotted at the locks, and then also later that evening at Golden Gardens, are spending more time in the Puget Sound. And the reason for that is that they eat seals. And so, as seals and sea lions have rebounded after the Mammal Protection Act, that's also drawn the transient whales in. Researchers aren't totally sure why the southern residents are being seen less, but there was sort of an interesting little piece that I wanted to pull out, which is that the southern residents are organized as a matriarchal society led by the female elders in their pods. And so researchers are wondering if there is some sort of grandma knowledge that's happening for the residents about where they should and shouldn't be going that hasn't been passed on to the transient orcas because they don't really have the same social organization happening. And if that is actually why the difference between the two groups exists, which I thought was fascinating to think about.
So to quote Jeff Goldblum's character in the Jurassic Park series, nature just finds a way.
She
It
sure
finds
does.
a way.
And I mean, it's very normal for like, aging male hipsters to find their way to Ballard in the absence of any sort of matriarchal leadership.
That is, that is too true, Mr. Hamill. Too true. That said, Joe, we also have a fire update for you on what's going on in Spokane. There are several safety net programs that have been expanded and expedited for the thousands of Washingtonians grappling with the 21 large wildfires burning throughout the state. Now, regardless of income, people who lost their home and do not have insurance can apply for the state individual assistance program, which can help with home repairs and temporary housing. The proclamation also bars eviction orders in the covered jurisdictions for the next 2 weeks. Before today, the Family Emergency Assistance Program was reserved for families with children during a disaster. Now families without children are also eligible because, yes, they are also families. Cash assistance from this program helps cover basic needs and is normally only distributed once a year.
As you were talking about this, Marcus, something I was thinking about is it's so interesting in these moments of disaster to see what the state is able to extend to people. And it really makes me think about like what would be possible as a response to the increasing homelessness crisis in our state if we were to extend these kinds of programs year round to people who weren't just dealing with fire disasters, but maybe also like just being unable to afford to pay to live in an apartment or a house.
Yeah.
To your point, I saw when I learned about this, it was in an article that showed our Black millennial socialist representative, Sean Scott, shaking hands on the die with Governor Bob Austerity Ferguson to do something for people. And I thought, hell yeah, maybe this is the way. I mean, this is it. This is the way. You've heard of sewer socialism, in which socialists take care of like basic civic needs and show that they know what they're doing. Well, this is like inferno socialism, if you want to call it that. This is an opportunity to show state capacity to actually provide material benefit to the people who live here. And even Bob has to admit it's the move. So I'm loving it.
Yeah, something that is also a part of this program that stood out to me was that for people who lost personal documents in the fire, like birth certificates or driver's licenses, they can start that process of obtaining new documents without charge. Wow. And something that I know from, covering homelessness in the state is that people's documents often get lost or taken during sweeps, and it's expensive and difficult to get those documents renewed or reissued. And so it would be interesting to see a similar program kind of instituted for people who, need those documents in order to get work or get housing and have to restart every time a sweep happens.
I'll say it's definitely amazing how often desperation brings out the socialist in all of us. Anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
That said, moving on to, I guess I could call it socialism in the sense that it's the free 99 thing that everybody can enjoy, in a very egalitarian way. There is a meteor shower ahead of us, folks. The Perseid meteor shower peaks Wednesday night into early Thursday morning. This year, the timing lines up almost perfectly with the new moon. So now there's potential for up to 100 meteors an hour, which definitely sounds like a lot. And with the unusually dark skies, it seems like it is going to be perfect viewing conditions. So I got to ask you all, are you going to go and look at them, and do you know what to even look for?
I live in the city, man. I'm not seeing jack. I'm not seeing any meteors here. This is just not happening.
Yeah, what about you, Sam?
I mean, I'm going to try, might as well step outside around midnight and see what I can spot. The fact that there won't be a moon in the sky to, be a little diva and take up all the all the light. Maybe I'll get to see something, some meteors going.
Yeah, maybe it's a good omen. I don't know.
Nice work.
Yeah, but for folks who do actually want to see it, you can generally look northeast, but keep an eye on the entire sky rather than just focusing on one spot. Because meteors can appear in any direction. There will be no telescope needed, just a reclining chair and a little patience. Do you all know the history of the Perseids? No? That's a no?
Absolutely not.
You know why I do? Because our wonderful producer put in some historic knowledge for me to read. Anyway, the Perseids come from debris left behind by Comet 109P / Swift Tuttle, an icy ball that orbits the sun every 133 years and isn't scheduled to return until 2125. I don't know if any of us intend to be living by that time, but
I sure hope not.
there you go.
That's way too long.
Much too long, I would say. Well, anyhow, good folks, that is going to do it for this edition of CityCast Seattle. Brett Hamil, thank you so very much for joining us today. Always a pleasure.
The pleasure is entirely mine, sir.
Sam J. Leeds, always a pleasure as well. I know you were required contractually to be here, but still, it was great.
I'm glad we got to talk about a full range of things in the city today, Marcus.
As am I. Well, that is all for today here at CityCast Seattle. I'm your fill-in host, Marcus Harrison Green. Listeners, we do want to hear from you, though. So send us your news, tips, questions, hot goss, or your thoughts about how to address youth gun violence, or tell us about your own orca sighting by sending an email to seattle@citycast.fm. You can also text us or leave us a voicemail on the CityCast hotline at 206-880-3931. Until next time, see you, Seattle, and take care of each other.